The headlines emanating from Washington and Tehran in the last 48 hours are not news. They are a script of systematic failure. When the mainstream media reports that Iran rejects a temporary ceasefire proposal, they frame it as a stubborn, irrational refusal of a humanitarian overture. This analysis is fundamentally flawed. It ignores the mechanics of power. When you understand the strategic architecture of the Middle East, you realize that a temporary ceasefire is not a bridge to peace. It is a tactical concession that Iran can no longer afford to make. The mathematics of this war is simple. In a conflict defined by asymmetric attrition, time is not a neutral currency. For the United States, time is a cost. For Iran, time is a weapon. To understand why Tehran has rejected this proposal, we must discard the emotional narrative of extremism and look at the cold, hard logic of the regional power balance. For years, the conventional theory of the Middle East was based on the assumption of American escalation dominance. The idea that the United States could dictate the tempo of conflict, set the terms of engagement, and force a resolution on its own schedule. That assumption is now, for all practical purposes, obsolete. The rejection of a ceasefire is not a symptom of Iranian irrationality. It is a clinical calculation of strategic necessity. In warfare, when a weaker actor is engaged in a war of attrition against a superior force, their objective is not to win battles. It is to survive the engagement long enough to force the superior force to conclude that the cost of the operation exceeds the value of the objective. This is what the strategists in Tehran have understood since the beginning. They are not looking for a win on the battlefield. They are looking for a total breakdown of the adversary's political will. Let us analyze the geography of this rejection. The Middle East is a theater of extreme density. It is not an open plain where air superiority can be decisive. It is a region defined by complex urban centers, rugged mountainous terrain like the Zagros, and critical maritime bottlenecks like the Strait of Hormuz. When you fight a war in this environment, technology is not the decisive factor, physics is. The pride of the U.S. Air Force cannot be defeated by stealth fighters, but it can be neutralized by the sheer geography of the conflict. Precision-guided missiles are useless when the cost of the missile exceeds the value of the target and when the target is buried deep within the earth. When Iran rejects a ceasefire, they are signaling that they have internalized the conflict. They are moving the war from the surface, where the United States has the advantage, to the substructure, where they hold the cards. They are transitioning into a full-scale command and control economy, where every resource is prioritized for the war effort and every civilian hardship is reframed as a patriotic duty. Western analysts often express confusion as to why Iran would choose this path, knowing the economic devastation it brings. They ask, why would they choose starvation over negotiation? The answer is that they don't view it as a choice between food and war. They view it as a choice between a war they can fight and a negotiation that leads to their total, systematic dismantling. To them, the negotiation is the trap. It is a mechanism for the United States to gather intelligence, rearm, and reset the board for a more decisive, more devastating strike later. This brings us to the second-order effects that the market is currently too distracted to price in. We are seeing a shift where the entire regional order is being forced to choose sides. For decades, the Gulf Cooperation Council states operated on the belief that they could balance their security between the U.S. and regional rivals. That period is over. As the U.S. sets a hard deadline and Iran rejects the terms, the regional states are realizing that the American security umbrella is not a permanent fixture. It is a variable. And when the protector's own internal political situation becomes the primary driver of their foreign policy, the security of the partner is no longer a priority. That is not a diplomatic crisis. That is the dissolution of a security architecture that has held the Middle East in a delicate, artificial balance for decades. The shift toward a post-American Middle East is not occurring because of a lack of will. It is occurring because of a lack of mathematical feasibility. The United States is attempting to project power in a region where its leverage, the dollar, the threat of sanctions, the promise of military protection, is being bypassed. The very act of imposing a deadline and a ceasefire proposal is an admission of loss. It is an attempt to freeze the conflict in a state that favors the status quo, but the status quo is precisely what is dying. If we look at the internal movement logs of logistical hubs across the region, we see a pattern of gradual, almost invisible repositioning. This is not the movement of an army preparing to conquer. It is the movement of a superpower preparing to extract itself from a zone where the cost-benefit analysis has turned irreversibly negative. The media, however, continues to play the same record. The U.S. is strong. The mission is vital. The deterrence is working. This creates a dangerous reality inversion. The more the U.S. insists that the status quo is the only viable outcome, the more they incentivize their adversaries to prove that it is not. By failing to offer a path that respects the core survival interests of their adversaries, the U.S. is not forcing a negotiation. They are ensuring a protracted, systemic breakdown. The reality that is being ignored is that Iran does not need the Strait of Hormuz to stay open for their own survival anymore. They have built an internal, shadow, and regional trade infrastructure that makes them less vulnerable to the global market than the United States is. When Washington threatens the global energy flow, they are not threatening Iran. They are threatening their own allies in Europe and Asia who are structurally dependent on that energy. The genius of the Iranian position is that they have turned the global dependency of the West into their primary, impenetrable defense. This is the central paradox of the current conflict. The more the United States tightens the economic screw, the more they destroy the very dependencies that gave them leverage in the first place. Every sanction, every tariff, every blockade is not a tool of control. It is a step toward the fragmentation of the global order. We are watching a superpower use its remaining tools of dominance to destroy the very world order it built. It is a slow, systematic, and inevitable decline that is being masked by the high-frequency noise of missile strikes and diplomatic ultimatums. We are not watching a war of movement. We are watching a war of exhaustion. And in a war of exhaustion, the victor is the one who understands that the battlefield is not the desert, but the economic and psychological stability of the home front. If the United States cannot maintain that stability, the outcome of the war will not be decided in the Strait of Hormuz. It will be decided in the currency markets and the voting booths of the Western capitals. The clock is ticking, but the alarm is not just for Iran. It is for the entire framework of global power. And that alarm, once it sounds, will signal the end of a world that we have been told would last forever. The focus on petrochemical assets, hubs of production and refinement, is not merely a military decision. It is an ideological assault on the concept of modern industrial capacity. By systematically targeting the very infrastructure that allows an autarkic nation to maintain internal equilibrium, the attacking power is attempting to force a transition from a functioning state to a failing one. However, this relies on a fundamental miscalculation regarding the nature of the modern Iranian economy. We are seeing a trend that should concern every market participant: the weaponization of the supply chain. If Iran and its proxies decide that the cost of defending these facilities is too high, they will not simply retreat. They will pivot. They will transition from protecting the oil flow to guaranteeing that if they cannot have access to it, no one else can either. This is the ultimate asymmetric card in the deck. It does not require a large navy. It requires only a few, well-placed, low-cost assets to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a graveyard for global trade. The mathematics of this war is simple. When you destroy the production capabilities of a regime that is already sanctioned out of the global market, you are not destroying its economy. You are accelerating its transition into a wartime command structure. The strategy of the West assumes that internal economic collapse will inevitably lead to regime change. History, however, suggests the opposite. Extreme economic distress creates a siege mentality that empowers the most radical elements of the security state. When the private sector is erased, the military and the Revolutionary Guard become the sole providers of goods, services, and stability. By targeting these hubs, the West is inadvertently helping Tehran complete its transition to a fully closed, militarized economic circuit. This is the ultimate asymmetric card in the deck. We must look at the second-order effects on the global energy landscape. The global market is not a neutral, objective mechanism. It is a complex, hyper-fragile web of dependencies. When Iranian petrochemical exports are disrupted, the immediate result is not just a price hike. It is a supply-side shock that ripples through the manufacturing sectors of Europe and Southeast Asia. The shock is not the event. The shock is the realization that the global system cannot absorb a single point of failure. If the insurance markets in London, the nervous system of global logistics, withdraw coverage for the region, the ships stop moving, the tankers go dark, and the price of energy enters a phase of volatility that no central bank can stabilize. This is the hidden trap that policymakers in Washington refuse to acknowledge. You do not need to sink a carrier group to paralyze the global economy. You only need to make the risk of transit too high for the private sector to bear. Once the insurance leaves, the world's most critical transit point becomes an empty, silent corridor. The strategic community in the West remains fixated on the idea that this is a manageable escalation. They believe that if they apply enough pressure, the rational forces within the Iranian leadership will eventually sue for peace. This is a profound misunderstanding of the regime's internal evolution. The pragmatic actors who once believed in the possibility of a negotiated settlement have been methodically purged or sidelined. What remains is a hardline coalition that views this conflict not through the lens of economic benefit, but through the lens of historical mission. They have reached a point where the cost of existence is war, and therefore war is the only rational state of being. We are entering a phase where military power is being decoupled from political outcome. The West has overwhelming firepower, but it has no clear political end state that is achievable through that firepower. It has the capacity to destroy, but not the capacity to govern. And in the absence of a governing strategy, destruction is not a tool of policy, it is a tool of chaos. This brings us to the ultimate, uncomfortable truth of this era. The global system is no longer organized around the principles of economic efficiency or the open movement of goods. It is organizing itself around the principle of resilience at the expense of integration. As these events continue to unfold, we should expect more, not less, of this systemic friction. The era of a seamless global market is behind us. We are moving toward a world where regional powers consolidate their spheres of influence, and where the cost of doing business will be determined by the proximity to conflict zones. For the average individual, this means that the era of cheap, reliable access to the fruits of global trade is ending. You are paying for the insecurity of the Strait of Hormuz in the price of your commute, the cost of your groceries, and the stability of your local economy. The distance between the conflict in the Middle East and your daily life is not geographic, it is economic, and that distance is shrinking every day. We are not watching the resolution of a conflict. We are watching the systematic dismantling of a global framework that was built on the assumption that it would last forever. It won't. And the final chapter of this history is already being written by those who recognize that the only true path to power in the next decade is not through winning the war, but through successfully surviving the collapse of the system that made the war possible in the first place. The trajectory is set. The only variable remaining is the degree of the friction that the rest of the world will be forced to absorb. And that is not a debate, that is a mathematical certainty. The American leadership, trapped in the survival calculus, will continue to push, creating more instability, more systemic fragility, and eventually a reality where the global order is just a memory. The Middle East is the epicenter of this collapse, but the shockwaves will reach every corner of the planet. There are no easy choices here, only trade-offs, only consequences. The reality is that the old architecture of stability is being replaced by the new architecture of disruption. Whether this collapse is accidental or orchestrated is a secondary question. The primary question is whether you are positioned to navigate the friction that follows. The transition is not coming, it is here. Adapt or become part of the wreckage. That is the only law that remains.